You're very welcome to the morning parallel sessions. I'm David Abbott from the University of Bristol, and I'll be chairing. We've got 3 papers, and each presentation will have 15 minutes to present, which I'll time carefully, and then 10 minutes question and answers. Just ask you to put your phones to silent, but obviously if you're using them to tweet or to follow the conference online, then feel free to keep them on and carry on the conversation online. I'll hand over in the first instance to Val Williams and John Simmons from the University of Bristol.
Thank you, David. So we're going to talk about the social care practitioner as assessor. And this is a project called the Values of Assessment, which is still ongoing but very nearly finished. The picture in the middle that we've got is of 2 hands shaking, and that's deliberate because the whole project is designed around co-production, but in the sense that we've got disabled people and practitioners coming together. And just to illustrate that, I'll just explain briefly that the project was co-produced with a disabled people's organisation in Bristol, and the disabled people's group has remained involved in the research. So we're going to be drawing on some of their insights during the presentation. But the disabled people aren't just disabled people. And we've got a wonderful mix of identities in this project. So it's a very, even within the core group of researchers, we've got John here, who is a social care practitioner. We've got three disabled academics now, and one of whom is a solicitor. And then within the disabled people's group, some of them are actually social care practitioners. And having said all of that, what really got us enthused was when we started doing interviews with practitioners. A large number of them actually identified as having lived experience of disability. I think it was 7, wasn't it? 7 who had actually identified as disabled. So having said all that, we've got this wonderful mix of identities, so different perspectives on the same phenomenon. And just before I hand over to John for the first few slides, I wanted to acknowledge that John has done massively the lion's share of the work on this project. It wouldn't have happened without him, and collecting all the data as well as really making it happen has been entirely down to John. So over to John.
How can I live up to that? So the timing of the study was well timed, really. The Care Act, as you'll know, was implemented in April last year, just around the time of interviewing practitioners, and it had a number of kind of pertinent things to say about how social care assessments were done. First of all, that they can be proportionate, as you'll know, but also in terms of identifying with a person what their chosen outcomes were in terms of their life, what needs they had in order to achieve those outcomes, and the significance of the impact on their life in not achieving them. And this was very helpful for us, and it was one of the things that we really wanted to explore with people around, particularly with practitioners, about how do you negotiate what an outcome is, which outcomes are relevant along those lines. So the study itself ran from October 2014. It's finishing next month, so we're just in the process of writing up papers and disseminating to the local authorities who took part in it. The 3 main aims of it were, firstly, to find out from disabled people themselves what their experiences were of being assessed. What's it like having a social worker come into your house, sometimes with a form, and ask you lots of personal questions, and what the outcomes were. Secondly, to learn from practitioners how they went about doing assessments, the kinds of things that they faced when conducting assessments and how they managed those. And thirdly, to help practitioners and disabled people develop practices on both sides around assessments. So, as I said, one of the things that we've been doing is working alongside a group of disabled people, and from next week we'll be delivering workshops to agencies that are co-delivered by them with the key messages. Methods. there were 3 narrative circles, so 3 groups of disabled people that were interviewed following a narrative format about their experiences. We were trying to cover a range of impairments represented by people, so we supplemented those with 4 additional interviews, for example, by visiting a dementia group and getting kind of a bit interview data from them as well. We've mentioned semi-structured interviews with 30 practitioners and people in senior roles, so there might be advanced practitioners, team managers and senior manager in one case over 3 local authorities, using grounded theory analysis to interpret the data. I've kind of referred already to a co-production group drawn out of some of the disabled people who were involved in the narrative interviews, then formed a group with whom we analysed sections of the interview data with practitioners. So we would take extracts of the interviews that we thought were of interest and discuss them within the research group, which, as Val's already mentioned, had a number of identities and interests within it, shared them with the group of disabled people to ask, well, what do you think is going on here? What's your view? How does it match up with your experience? And that all informed the analysis as it went on. And then the third phase was collecting audio recordings of 7 assessments that actually happened. So a small number of practitioners agreed to ask people for their consent for them to record the assessment. On one occasion, I was able to go along as well with the recorder. And we've started doing some conversation analysis on specific things about that in terms of this is what people say about happens in assessments. These are some examples of what actually happens and how this plays out in the interaction.
Okay, and in this presentation we're going to mainly focus on the second of those phases. So we're mainly talking about the practitioner interviews and the way they were interpreted by the whole team, but we're going to touch on the conversation analysis at the end. Okay, so some themes from the practitioner data. We were able to work, as I say, with this wide team looking at the data to code it and to see what really mattered. So what I'm presenting here now arises from the interconnections between different codes. And the first one was about clients as people. And this speaks very much to the personalisation aspect, the person-centredness of assessments that's there in the Care Act. But actually what came out of our data was that the client was seen as a jigsaw of problems. People spoke about my client, my person, and they really cared about that person, but that person was seen as pretty much problematic. However, in practice, what people spoke about, one person talked about, for instance, leaving an open space for the client to have their say. And this is what person-centredness really means. It's about people actually being able to define their own outcomes and needs. So very much that was the discourse that they used there. And so one of the quotes around that was, if it's an area that the customer has no concern about their well-being, or it doesn't matter for them, then it won't bother us. Okay, so practitioners actually saw themselves as being on side with clients, and that became another interest of ours, how they saw themselves really as allies of the clients. And sometimes that was in direct contradiction to the bureaucracy of the organisation they worked with. And sometimes actually it was to actually stand against society's attitudes at large. So that quote was, I like the challenge of advocating for something that perhaps society would find difficult. So they were describing people who they saw as really problematic, and in some cases gave us examples, didn't they, of how neighbours had actually referred people and found this particular individual really difficult. So very much seeing themselves as allies then and clients as people. But moving on from that, we were interested, as I said, all along around identity. And we asked people about, practitioners, about their own identity and how they'd come into practice social work in the first place. And predictably, social workers, all, different range of practitioners, but they were all doing social work assessments, and they were people. They saw themselves as having always cared, as having always wanted to do something, and in the extreme, saw themselves as there to change the world. So that came over quite clearly. But what surprised us was the number of people, as we've mentioned already, who had direct experience, lived experience of being assessed themselves by virtue of a disability or by virtue of being a carer. So there were personal experiences within the family, and indeed several of them, as we've mentioned, had their own experience of disability. Although it was interesting that some people did articulate the fact that that could be a problem, because if you go in as a disabled person who's made it as a social worker, you could be putting over to the client that, they've got to kind of just get up, do something with their lives, and they really did realise that that could be a problem, and that everybody is different and everybody responds to disability in a different way. The one person memorably used that quote about the use of safe being really important, and if somebody sees that I've got the same sticks as him, it makes a difference in the relationship and the empathy with that person. So same sticks as him became one of our little themes, really. Okay. Sorry, yeah, okay. So the client, as we've said, was seen as somebody who can determine their own outcomes, but I'm just going to quickly outline what we're thinking about there. It was a spectrum, and there was a place on that spectrum where it flipped. And very much around people who, for instance, play the system. Those people can no longer be trusted. And so social care practitioners were seeing them as, perhaps not being able to advocate for their own needs accurately. And of course the opposite was true as well, that some people weren't actually saying enough about what they needed. And so at that point, professional judgment, this word professional judgment occurred a lot, and that's what kicked in then. That's a really nice soundbite that somebody gave us. Sometimes they need help but don't want it, and sometimes they want help and don't need it. So it's these people who become, if you like, untrustworthy. And the Disabled People's Group actually commented on some of this data and said, talked about the way that affected them, sort of feeling that they were a bit stupid, that when somebody walked through the door and started not to trust their own word, it became a very negative experience for them. Oh, you're not coping. Well, I am coping, but then, you start feeling stupid, as though you can't actually advocate for yourself. So leading on from that, a lot of practitioners talked about assessments happening all the time. And that was just a quote from an OT who talked about going right from the point that they knocked on the front door, they're gathering information for the assessment. And further than that, people talked about deliberately asking the client to go and make a cup of tea so that they could watch whether the client could actually do it or not. They might go to the bathroom to have a look round. So all of this was happening all the time and in a covert way, because they weren't actually telling people about it. Again, outlining the expert role of the social work practitioner. And predictably, some of the disabled people that we were working with felt that was really problematic area, because practitioners were trying to catch them out and working as detectives on them. And actually they did have experience of that as well, that they shared with us in the narratives. So finally then, the advocating for my client, as I say, this sort of ownership of my client was interesting, became almost positioning yourself between the client and the system, and there was a sort of negotiation of the interface that we could see going on between the client and the agency. So we're negotiating on behalf of the service user, and we want to influence things on their behalf. But actually, this tension that we all talk about between being on the person's side and protecting the public purse, most of that seemed to happen upstream, if you like, of the final stage where you get the care plan approved. And so you can see some of that happening in some of our recordings where people are, practitioners are trying to help people to determine the right outcomes and the right needs that will actually get funded, so it never comes to a conflict. And that's one of the really intriguing things that we'll be able to analyse using conversation analysis. So, over to John.
So there is a broad agreement between participants that assessments happen through interaction, and practitioners certainly talked about some of the difficulties and challenges that came up during that. So they would talk about trying to introduce the assessment process and explain it at the beginning, so that people had more of an idea of what was involved, but also trying to manage the balance between building a relationship, the classic kind of tension within social work about the relationship, and also asking the questions on the form, or kind of getting the job done, the task. So there was one quote from a practitioner who explicitly talked about apologising as a way to introduce questions that they had to ask about things like personal care. One of the other tensions that came up for practitioners was around managing carers, family members, third parties in the meeting, and how you can still get the voice of the service user most prominent in the assessment, but still incorporating the views of people around them. Given what Val's just been talking about sometimes treating people as maybe not fully giving full information about their needs, or maybe overstating them, then carers and family members were certainly used quite actively by practitioners to kind of moderate that. Now there's one example that we're going to try and play through here. This is from a recording. Now Jo is the social worker. She is conducting an assessment with Sue, who is about 30 years old and has had a brain injury. Mel is also present. Mel is Sue's mother, and Jerry is Sue's husband. Okay, so there are 4 people in the recording. The names are anonymised, and in the recording we've deleted the sections where the names are, so you shouldn't be able to hear who they are. Let's see. Is it on a clip?
Yeah, it's on the mouse.
Okay.
What about the cooking and all that sort of stuff?
But they've got the use of one arm, really.
Right.
I mean, she could do certain things, can't you? But
yeah.
it's
So
difficult.
meal preparation.
The left arm is virtually useless. So
Right.
Really comes.
Okay.
So John and I have just started looking at these bits of data together, and just wanted to very quickly explain the kind of thing that we can do with CA. So if you look at that very short transcript, it'll be obvious to everybody in the room that carers are talking and talking for people. But what actually happens, Jo, the social worker, does what we call at the beginning in that first term, a sort of opener really. She's introducing a new topic in the form of a question. Now, when people ask questions, we get very interested in what happens next. And the way that somebody does something after a question will show you how the person has taken the question, which is very interesting. So how does Sue take that question? She orients really to the relevance of who cooks here. And you can see that it's actually a very ordinary conversational question. So if somebody said to me, who does all the cooking around here? You know, I'd say, well, my husband does. You know, and that's fine. At that point, the conversation could have stopped, couldn't it? That bit could have stopped. But actually what happens is that Mel, the family carer, comes in with an alternative second part, saying, oh, Sue's only got the use of one arm. Now, when somebody has already answered and somebody else then answers after that, there's an implication that the first person didn't give an adequate answer. So that's happening already. But you can see also how Mel's turn orients to a different underlying intention in the original question. So she interprets it quite explicitly as being about the impairment. And so because she then says, oh, she's only got the use of one arm, it changes the rest of the flow of that talk. It becomes around Sue's impairment. And we've taken little extracts like that. We've started taking them to different groups of people, including the disabled people we work with, just to see what happens next. And original version of this, we were going to play you what happens next, but we haven't got time. Yep. If you want to know what happens next, come and ask us. And we're just going to sum up.
There's some points there that you can reflect on,
Yeah.
but we're open for questions.
Thank you very much. It's phone questions type for time, and actually there isn't time for questions for Val and John at this point. But we'll have to move on to the next, despite a really interesting presentation. I know you're here all day and around at lunchtime, so if you want to find out more, please find them in the break. I need to press on to the next paper and welcome Josie Dixon, who is from the LSE and who's talking about equity and end-of-life care.
I don't know where my presentation is.
It goes straight on.
Does it?
Yeah,
So I shouldn't have done that. So I should go back into...
Go back into from current slide.
I assumed I'd have to go to the desktop. How do I get back to... Sorry,
with
just
the
being
mouse.
I use a Mac, and so now I'm totally confused by
Use the mouse only.
Oh, that's why it's not working.
And then
Super duper. Thank you very much. Okay. Good morning. Good morning. Indeed, it is still. Okay. What am I pressing to move forward? Absolutely useless. I can't do that every time, can I? Okie dokie. I'm going to give a very speedy introduction to evolving end-of-life care in England for people who might be less familiar with that background. Before I move on and talk about our study, we had a national end-of-life care strategy in 2008. It was a very wide-ranging strategy, but there was a clear focus on moving care out of the hospital and into the community where most people want to be cared for if possible. And related to that, a key and evolving role for social care. Many of the initiatives and programmes that were part of the national strategy have now been absorbed into the work of government departments and agencies, so Public Health England, for example. More recently, we've had the publication of the Ambitions document, and that's Ambitions for Palliative and End-of-Life Care, a National Framework for Local Action. And that was produced by the National Palliative and End-of-Life Care Partnership, which is comprised of all the major policy stakeholders in the area, so NHS England, the Royal Colleges, all the major end-of-life care charities, as well as ADAS and Social Care Institute for Excellence. And throughout all of this, equity has been a key concern. So fair access to care is one of the 6 ambitions in the Ambitions document. And we're very shortly going to see the publication of CQC's themed review of equity and end-of-life care. So there has to be an easier way of moving forward. I could use the arrow button, sure. Okay, so this was the context that we, with funding from Marie Curie, set about exploring equity in palliative and end-of-life care. And what we did was we undertook a thoroughgoing review of the literature, and we also, working with ONS, conducted new multivariate regression analyses of data from the National Survey of Bereaved People, so what's known as the Voices Survey. And that was to identify the independent effects of characteristics and circumstances of individuals at end of life, on their access to services and end of life outcomes. The National Survey of Bereaved People is a really rich source of information about experiences of at end of life. And it has a really large sample size. So the sample we had was close to 22,000 people. And they're the factors that we controlled for. Okay, so I'm going to just summarise some of the key findings from the study, looking at each of these factors in turn. There's evidence to suggest that people with non-cancer conditions experience similarly complex and difficult symptoms at end of life, but they have much less access to specialist palliative care. The national strategy and the associated initiatives have meant that that proportion has increased, so from 12% in 2008 up to 20% in 2013-14. That is still 80% of people accessing specialist palliative care who have cancer, whereas cancer accounts for 30% of deaths. So there's still a gap to close there. People have argued that it might be that people with non-cancer conditions actually require and are receiving more generalist care. But that doesn't seem to be the case. This study from Georgiou and Bardsley, a London-based study with a very large sample, actually found that people with non-cancer conditions were also receiving significantly less generalist care. And in our analysis of the reanalysis of the Voices data, we found that people with non-cancer conditions had less access to a range of home and community-based services, and that people caring for people with non-cancer conditions at home were feeling less supported. People with cancer generally achieve better end-of-life outcomes. They're more likely to have their pain relieved completely all the time at home, more likely to die in their usual place of residence than in hospital, and relatives are more likely to say that the care they received at end-of-life was excellent or outstanding. There are inherent challenges in delivering end-of-life care to people with non-cancer diagnoses, so that is absolutely a fact. However, there are also service gaps, and there are urgent needs for service development. Community-based services have been built around a cancer model, and the expertise and skills needed to deliver care to people with non-cancer conditions might be lacking. And the models of care, the different models of care that may be needed for those groups are not necessarily there yet, and it speaks to Lynn's point this morning about needing to build interventions and evidence. In case I've given the impression that everything's all rosy for people with cancer, I just want to say that isn't necessarily the case. People who are receiving active treatment in the late stages of their disease, and people with haematological cancers are as likely to experience difficulties in accessing palliative and end-of-life care. So setting, I want to say a little something just about care homes primarily. Because the role of care homes in delivering end-of-life care is really significantly changing. Care home residents have increasingly complex needs, they're increasingly frail, they increasingly have dementia, and the proportion of care home residents that die within a year of admission has increased over the years. So in '97 it was 28%, it's currently about 56%. So that's very different. In 2008, the NAO found really wide variation between care homes in the proportion of residents that died in place, from all residents to no residents at all. Undoubtedly, that variation is still there, but overall, we know that more people are now dying in their care home than in hospitals. So all of this is changing the role of the care home in end-of-life care. And from the available evidence, it seems that some care homes are not adapting or not finding it easy to adapt to this new situation, with evidence of insufficient external support, poor coordination and confusion about roles, a lack of clarity about the care home's role in delivering palliative care, unclear policies and lack of staff training. That's not to say there aren't, examples of excellence out there, but that's available evidence on general picture. Want to go say something about ethnicity. How am I doing? Oh, excellent. I think these findings are really interesting. It has generally been believed that people from Black, Asian, minority ethnic groups, BAME groups, are less likely to access palliative care services. 14% of the general population is from a BAME group, while only 6.2% of people accessing specialist palliative care are. However, you have to bear in mind the different age profile of BAME groups compared to the white majority population. If you look just at the population of people over 65 years, and that's the age group that the vast majority of deaths occur, only 4% of that population is from a BAME group. So it isn't obvious at all that people from BAME groups are accessing specialist palliative care or services less. In our analyses of voices data, we also found that people from BAME groups experience similar access to a range of home and community-based services. In fact, in some cases, in the first 3 on that list, they were accessing more. There's a kind of important caveat in that we don't know, that it's not there in the data, about the level, the frequency and the quality of the services received. There's also debate about whether people from BAME backgrounds are more likely to die in a hospital in our analyses than at home. In our analyses of the voices data, we found there was no difference. People from BAME backgrounds were just as likely to die at home as people from white backgrounds. Other studies have found an effect of ethnicity on hospital deaths. So this study by Kaufman, for example, London-based study with a very large sample, but they use the indicator of place of birth. So effectively, they're looking at first-generation BAME groups, whereas obviously the voices data is also looking at British-born. This final study is very recent. Bardsley and his team from Nuffield, they use HEST data, and they find a really small effect of ethnicity on hospital death and a very slightly larger but still very small effect on admissions and length of stay and last year of life. But those effects are dwarfed by diagnosis and age, which are much more important predictors. When you look at the care home sector, however, you have a much clearer picture of apparent disadvantage. People from BAME backgrounds are more likely to die in hospital than in their care home compared to their white counterparts. And their relatives are less likely to rate overall care as excellent or outstanding. That's actually true across all settings, I should say, but it's really marked in care homes. I'm on the last stretches. Area deprivation. So people from more deprived areas had similar access to home and community-based support from a range of different providers, with the same caveat that we don't have any information about the level, frequency and quality of those services. But nonetheless, they were less likely to feel that they had sufficient support to care for a dying person at home, and people at end of life were less likely to die in place, less likely to die at home, more likely to die in hospital. In more deprived areas, the overall quality of care was less likely to be considered outstanding or excellent, as was the care received from GPs, also less likely to be considered excellent, which was the highest rating. I think that's of some concern as end-of-life care moves more out into the community, and it has the potential of actually exacerbating existing inequities. Care in hospital is consistently rated as lower quality than care in other settings, but it is at least equally poor across all groups. I'm going to skip through age just to say that people in older age groups have disproportionately less access to specialist palliative care despite evidence of similar symptom burden. There are some really interesting and slightly equivocal and difficult to interpret results around pain control for people in older age groups, and also on satisfaction or assessments of quality. And if anyone wants to know more about that, I can say some more about that. But I think we need to sort of question the data around some of those areas and bring some external evidence to bear and think about what the evidence suggests. So I'm going to leave you with a quote from Catherine Sleeman, which I think is quite powerful. She says, despite decades of political rhetoric concerning equality of access to end-of-life care, the evidence suggests significant disparities still exist and are increasing. How can we best reduce these inequalities? Should we try? Are we trying? That's the reference to our report. And I was also asked to just bung a slide on the end. I won't talk to it, but that's about the project I'm currently working on, which is funded by the School for Social Care Research. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Josie. So we've got time for some questions, comments. That's at the back there. You might just say who you are and then ask your question.
Hi, Patricia. I was just wondering if there's any within the database that you are able to isolate LGBT people in palliative care, or because I know there is been research recently in childcare, and there's very specific issues associated with LGBT population.
Yeah.
I just wondered if you managed to
Look at that at all. We did in the literature review. I'm having terrible memory for names, but a chap at King's College has done some work in this area. Yes. But that as a variable that doesn't exist in the Voices data. We also, although it's a huge sample, it's once you start doing subgroup analyses and regression analyses, even in the BAME group, we couldn't break that down any further. Yeah, the evidence is fairly scant, and it's for all the usual reasons. There's no kind of, a lot of it's kind of qualitative work. There's no sample frame. I mean, in fact, that's some of the BAME research has suffered from, some similar difficulties. Catherine Evans talks about how a lot of the qualitative research takes place in areas, I wish I could remember her quote, places that are marked by something, but they're places that have strong kind of immigrant populations, and research there isn't necessarily generalisable. So the challenge, I think, with the LGBT stuff is the same, is demonstrating sort of that some of the findings apply to people in all sorts of circumstances. I could talk about the specific issues, but be here for a while.
Any other?
I did.
Yeah, is there anything of distinction between sort of health and social care?
Sorry.
Any distinctions between health and social care inputs to palliative care?
I didn't look at that in enormous amount of detail, but when we looked at care delivered in the community, there's no sample frame, there's no routine data collected, so it's really hard to know what's going on. But a lot of the qualitative research, and some of it was very thoroughgoing and had large samples and was sustained. You won't be surprised to hear kind of stories of poor coordination, confusion about roles, reluctance in some cases to take on certain roles. All the integration issues. And you'd hope that with some of the initiatives, the integration initiatives, and I'm thinking of Airedale, for example, that are doing a lot of integration work around end of life. I haven't got really close to it, but you kind of hope that some of these issues are being better addressed than when the research we looked at was carried out.
Time for one more.
In the research I quoted earlier, Jill and Joe had done, one of the areas where there was positive satisfaction was from palliative care social workers, but they also identified a lot of unmet So there's obviously something about people experiencing that sort of relational work that social work does. Are you picking up anything in your research around that?
Not so much in this study that I can think of, but I mean, I think that's an absolute key point. Specialist palliative care social workers have got fairly sparse, and I would hope that there are, I mean, I guess it's the whole social work role. I'm currently looking at the role of social workers in end-of-life care in the US and Australia. And there is a sort of different framework, and I think there's a need to sort of reinvigorate. You kind of hope that sort of agendas such as these might reinvigorate the social work role, because there's a vital need for the generalist social workers, but specialist palliative social workers who really understand the kind of issues that are involved, commonly attached to hospices. Currently, I only know of specialist palliative social workers attached to hospices. Maybe they're elsewhere, but not. Someone's shaking their head. So, I think that's really powerful. People, there are it's the whole recognition that death is not just a medical event, and that when you're seriously ill or you're caring, your life is just dissembled, and we have these slightly sort of fluffy pictures of very devoted carers. Families, are complex things, and there are all sorts of situations that people are in, and I think the social work role for navigating some of those wider issues is really important. I'd be interested to know what you think.
Well, the palliative care social workers have just produced some good practice guidance, actually, and we're hoping to use that to try and amplify the role that they have. And certainly in some places, they are starting to get social workers into more community palliative care teams with an emphasis on that. So I think it's an opportunity.
Thank you.
Joshi, thank you. There were a couple of minutes, and I wondered if anyone had a particular burning question for John and Val that we could slip into this. I'll still make sure that Martin has his time, but I realised we didn't have question time for, and I just wanted to check with anyone in the room. We're happy to move on. Okay, we'll carry on. All right, well, in that case, then we'll Josie, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so our final presentation is from Martin Stevens from King's, and he's talking about safeguarding. Thanks very much.
Okay, hi, nice to see you all. I'm going to be talking about this project called Models of Safeguarding, which we entered. It's funded by the School for Social Care Research a few years ago. It's quite a large research team. Joe Moriarty and Katie in the second row who were part of the study. This page down. First of all, we put this up. Jill, our boss, makes us do this to say that this is independent. It's research funded by the School for Social Care, School for Social Care Research, but it's basically our views and not theirs, and also not the Department of Health. And thanking the participants. Okay, I'm just going to do basically a quick overview of the research, really, this in the presentation. So a little bit about background and some of the literature that we looked at, and then describe the study and some of the findings and sort of conclusions. It's a really sort of high-level view of the research, so I'm not going into a great deal of detail. Just as a bit of background about adult safeguarding, developed out of adult protection, or at least it sort of was a change of terminology. The first real sort of synthesised policy was No Secrets in 2000, which there's a strong guidance that local authorities should develop multi-agency procedures and so on, but actually it wasn't a statutory duty at that point, but also the key thing perhaps and the driver for the study is there was no prescription on how local authorities organise adult safeguarding, and that is true even after the Care Act created the duty for local authorities to make inquiries or ensure others do so, where there's a belief about an adult being at risk. So that was, in a way, the driver was because of this lack of lack of, hang on, have I gone down twice? Oh no, sorry. The lack of prescription about how you organise safeguarding, and particularly, obviously of particular relevance now that it is a statutory duty, but it had been extremely strong guidance. So we undertook a sort of multi-phased and a mixed method study, and we were looking at answering how have models of safeguarding been addressed in the literature. By a model, we just meant how have local authorities implemented safeguarding, and what are the different factors that vary across the way they've implemented it. And we wanted to look at if there are any key variables between the different models, or just the key variables around organisation, and can we identify any outcomes linked to different models of safeguarding. We did a literature review and interviews with it was 24 senior adult safeguarding managers from 24 different local authorities, and this was in a view to identify, getting them to give an overview of the way they organise adult safeguarding. Phases 2 and 3, phases is the wrong word actually. I think now the modern phrase would be work package, but we didn't use that. So we identified 5 sites and undertook some in-depth work. It was quite interesting because we initially thought they had 5 different models, and then it turned out that when we talked to them more depth, 2 of the sites had very similar models that we hadn't really. So we collapsed the initial 5 models into 4. We did a staff survey, and that's social workers mainly involved in adult safeguarding, and did some secondary statistical analysis of the abuse of vulnerable adults returns, which is now called the safeguarding adults returns, and also tried to link it to the adult social care survey around which to gain some idea about outcomes. The final part of the study, in the same 5 sites, it was basically a qualitative wing, really. We did interviews with safeguarding managers, practitioners and managers. We tried to interview people going through safeguarding, but it proved impossible in the end to recruit people, so we didn't manage to do that. We did some feedback interviews with care home managers, housing staff, IMCAs, independent mental capacity advocates, and local authority solicitors. So I tried to get a range of perspectives on how safeguarding was working. From the literature review, we identified 3 key variables that around how models of safeguarding varied. I mean, probably the most obvious one, and I think the one we certainly focused on, was the degree and nature of specialism within safeguarding practice. So there was a number of studies actually based around Kent, Cambridge and colleagues had looked at the development of different safeguarding models and how specialists, and there were other literature we found looking at the impact, how specialists, was it ranging from being a completely separate activity undertaken by a specialist teams, or being a completely a task that's integrated with other kinds of care, social work practice. The second of those variables is around decision making and thresholds around decisions about whether a referral or a concern, as it sort of would be termed now, was required a safeguarding response. I mean, you can think of it in a number of ways. It's possibly about thresholds, but it was also about routing a concern to the most appropriate response. Thinking about whether a safeguarding response would actually address the problem that had been identified. And then finally was the issue of multi-agency working and how that was organised and how successful that was, which has been a strong theme throughout the development of adult safeguarding policy since the No Secrets policy. So from phase 1 and our thinking about it, we've picked out 4 models of safeguarding, and as you can see, they do focus quite a lot on the different ways in which safeguarding is, who actually does the safeguarding and in what kind of context. So the first one is what we call dispersed and generic, meaning that safeguarding referrals and concerns are managed and undertaken by operational social work teams. Often team managers might do a sort of coordinating kind of role, and social workers would do more of investigations, and sometimes different social workers and not the original social workers might do it, but the idea is that it's everyone, any social work practitioner might get involved in doing that. The second one was called dispersed specialist, where you have safeguarding specialists who work within the area teams. And referrals can be managed in different kinds of ways. Sometimes it might be that the specialist just does a coordinating role. Sometimes they take the whole thing on. But the key thing was that it was a specialist function, but it wasn't a centralised team. And they had two sort of centralised specialist models. One where you had there was this distinction between different kinds of referral, like high risk, which was defined in a number of ways. Referrals were managed by the specialist team, and what were determined low risk, and depending on how those decisions were made around that, they had various frameworks of risk and so on. And finally, there was the fully specialist team, where almost all safeguarding work was undertaken by a specialist safeguarding team. So these are the sort of models that were identified, and we had 2 dispersed specialist sites in the end. Now, the implications of models which we've got from the qualitative work, really. So you had a sort of distinction. I mean, really, as you might expect, the staff in less specialist sites, where almost everyone is doing safeguarding, they felt they had more knowledge of the particular groups of people they were working with, whereas specialist staff had increased knowledge of safeguarding processes, law and procedures, including multi-agency working. So there was that, as you might expect, the distinction of the sort of levels of confidence in knowledge. There was, from the qualitative work, but actually wasn't borne out in the survey, about in more specialist sites, mainstream social workers had less confidence in their safeguarding practice. What was also key was, again, possibly as you might expect, prioritising work was more challenging for social workers in the less specialist sites. So if you have a safeguarding referral amidst assessments and reviews, that sort of takes over, and then it's hard to prioritise, or it's hard to sort of understand which is the most important thing, and safeguarding tend to push out all the other work, which is a bit of a problem. In some of those sites where you had that mix of specialist and sort of operational, there was some tensions about what kinds of safeguarding work were allocated to the more specialist or the generic teams. Where you have more specialist safeguarding involvement, that was identified an issue about there were more handovers and less continuity. So you might be a social worker working with a family or a particular person, and then there's a safeguarding referral that you have to give information to a specialist team that then does the safeguarding, and you're sort of still involved. And then when the safeguarding team withdraws, there's a sort of handover back. And obviously handovers are always chances for information to get lost, or changes and moments of potential difficulty. Now, thinking about this is from the statistical analysis, and we found that in the dispersed specialist sites, we did a polynomial regression, logistic regression. I think that's what my brain's gone for the name. But we found that basically in dispersed specialist sites, where a referral was gone through safeguarding, it was more likely to be substantiated. So in a way, there were fewer referrals that ended up being investigated and then found that there was the actual abuse either hadn't happened or there wasn't enough evidence. So there was that was one factor about the dispersed specialist sites. And there were factors actually across the board. I mean, this is from the survey that staff felt generally positive about their levels of effectiveness. And actually, which model of safeguarding they worked in actually had little impact on the social workers' view of their own effectiveness in safeguarding. Things like good relationships with teams and good support from managers, all related to higher views of personal sort of effectiveness of safeguarding. So that was quite an interesting finding about the actual importance of these kinds of models. We had some feedback from the various people I mentioned, particularly care home managers, valuing of a properly functioning multi-agency safeguarding hub, and that was there were mashes in the sites with different models, and it was, I mean, obviously the specialist site had a fully operational MASH, but the other sites were either working towards it or had developed something along the lines of. Also about where there was felt to be knowledgeable and professional social workers in safeguarding, how supportive they were. A key thing about access to local authority training for care home staff relating to safeguarding was important. And then you had some criticisms around where it was felt social workers had a high caseload. I think that the issue of knowledge, I think, as well, was very important. It goes back to the idea of, the different kinds of knowledge and the different kinds of under the different kinds of models, and how important it is to have that kind of background of knowledge. Through the study, these were the priorities for training that we identified. Law, again, it is in common with a lot of research about the social care law, Mental Capacity Act, deprivation of liberty, the implications of the Care Act, and around court work. Although in the centralised specialist site, that was less important. Again, you've got that idea that obviously with a very specialist team, they do develop that kind of expertise. Okay, we finished. Too quick. I tried to shorten it so much that I get to fit the time. I feel too much of a job. Never mind. So as I was saying, in a way, the model of safeguarding was less important than expected. You did have that sense that there was that increase in I suppose the accuracy of the referral process and investigation process in the dispersed specialist sites. But in general, the study highlighted the importance of, that outweighed the particular model, more sort of relational kinds of factors around good management, good relationships between and within teams. I think the importance of having a sort of a rational and acceptable and workable means of allocating safeguarding work between the specialists and mainstream social workers, again, was seen as important. That ongoing training, I think ongoing multi-agency training, giving the opportunities for people from different organisations and agencies to train together to get that joint sense of responsibility. And we sort of speculated, and this may be, requirements for further research really, that the choice of model may be more linked to local factors, in terms of the stability of the population and workforce, where perhaps you have in less stable populations and less stable workforces, you might require the development of specialist approaches. And actually as well, there were a number of factors which, this might go to a different sort of thinking about this further. Particularly just in terms of the kind of the geography of the local authority, where you have a big local authority with lots of different areas, having one specialist team is maybe quite impractical. So there are a number of things. Okay, that's it from me.
Martin, thank you very much, and we do have 10 minutes for questions, answers and comments.
I don't know if this is an unfair question. I happen to know you did some cost work.
We did.
I know it was sort of challenging, and I'm just wondering if you can say anything about the costs of the different models.
Yes, we did some cost work, and actually, you're right. I could have put that in actually. In this again, it's hard to say whether this is how valid this is, which is why I'm a bit reluctant about it. But we found that the dispersed specialist site again was actually, and we did this in several ways, but they were cheaper per substantiated referral, if you like, but they weren't when you looked at the cost per referral because of this increased accuracy. They weren't working on a lot of referrals that weren't substantiated or as many. I don't think there's any point in the actual figures, but that was the differences that we noticed. Probably that's the clearest thing to say.
I just wonder if you could say a bit more about that topic about what you just referred to as accuracy in terms of referrals, because to me that sets all kinds of alarm bells ringing, because I'm worried about all those referrals that weren't made
Yes.
and didn't get through because someone lower down, less skilled, less expert, decided they weren't worth investigating. And actually when you create a system that has greater accuracy, it also has some inaccuracies.
Well, I suppose it begs the question,
which can be
doesn't
very
it?
dangerous. And we don't pay attention to lapses in adult safeguarding. We don't have headlines like we had headlines about that poor child this week. About adult safeguarding issues. So it kind of, it slips under the radar.
Well, I guess it depends. I
gets
suppose, I mean, that's, again, it's probably worthy of further investigation, because if it is actually accurate, then that's a good thing, because doing a safeguarding investigation where one isn't necessary can cause harm in its own right. So it's a question of, and it goes back to that decision making about when should it be a safeguarding referral. I think we found, I'm looking at Katie, that we found slightly the reverse than what you're saying, where there was more senior managers. This is from the literature review, isn't it? Where there was more senior managers taking those decisions, actually they were less. They accepted fewer. That's right, Katie, isn't it? Yeah. So it worked the other way around. When you had people with less qualifications, less experience making those decisions, they tend to be more conservative and put them through. But it is a question. The question is, did they have more a higher percentage of substantiated referrals because they just weren't referring enough? Or is it actually they had got, they'd managed to identify and the ways those decisions were made were good?
Could you say anything more about different kind of frameworks local authorities use to decide what was and what wasn't? Because I know certainly some authorities that I've worked with were having big debates about that, and I think there's still a very pressing need for authorities to identify a difference between adult safeguarding and the management of quality in care.
Yes.
Because I think a lot of things that are coming through and kind of clogging up the adult safeguarding process are actually to do with effective management of the quality of care.
Yes. I mean, I don't know that they had. They certainly had frameworks for once it had been accepted as a safeguarding referral, they had frameworks for deciding whether it was high or low risk. I mean, simple numerical judgments about sort of immediacy and level of risk. They also used some. Well, I find it a bit strange in the way they decided that some places decided that any referral involving a care home or residential service was automatically high risk. And what were the other ones, Katie? I can't remember. There were a number of different reasons, weren't there, why some were higher risk than others.
Yeah, these terms, they were vague though, they were really difficult for us to understand the complexity. Involving multiple agencies to begin with, those are the kinds of criteria.
That was the institutional one and yes, I mean, so there were a number of different, and sometimes they decided that, specialists would deal with all of those, say, multi-agency ones or residential care ones. But I don't know that they had, that we came across actual frameworks for making decisions. There were different levels, and there were often contact centres that were sort of passing that on at a very basic level, but they would probably pass on probably more. They'd probably be like to, even if it was just mentioned, they would pass that on to a safeguarding team or a team manager who would then make the decision about that.
I'm not surprised that you found it difficult to engage with services or carers who had ongoing safeguarding investigations processes. But I was wondering, you only refer to where safeguarding investigations were substantiated. But do you have any insight into whether people actually felt safeguarded, felt safe at the end of these, rather than the allegations being substantiated against?
Well, I
mean, question. Do you want to sum up?
This is about whether people who had their allegations substantiated, whether they felt safer.
Protected.
Yes. I mean, again, this was the problem. We couldn't get at that because we didn't actually engage with people. You'd really need to engage with that. I mean, obviously, I picked out that finding about. So we did look at how many referrals there were and how many you know, the different routes through them, that I just picked out that because that was where there was a difference. But that would be, you're right, I mean, there are other studies that are trying to finding that out.
Making safeguarding personal was running alongside this study,
Yeah.
which was actually asking that question. So
Yeah.
we weren't able to provide
No.
any data. We couldn't
No.
answer whether we
No.
could.
Yeah. No.
Please.
Martin, you made a statement, a short statement, that in more specialist sites, the mainstream social workers felt less confident.
In safeguarding,
In
yeah.
safeguarding,
Yeah.
in practice, yeah.
Yeah.
And yet we hear all time and time again, safeguarding is everybody's business.
Yeah.
So, did anyone actually do anything about that? Like, what's kind of, is there a focus on how do you improve people's confidence, or do you just accept that because we've got specialists, it doesn't matter? You know, how do we, is that having an impact on people's practice?
Well, I mean, that was, yes, I mean, they didn't talk about actually what they'd done to change that. I mean, I think this idea of joint training and working, I mean, it is about that, and it's about focusing on the relationships between teams, actually, as well. That was the other thing that came out, the importance of that. If you had good relationships across the teams, that would improve your confidence in safeguarding. So something around joint interactions and thinking about how, you know, safeguarding is sort of addressed within the authority and how those decisions are made around who does what if some people are involved. I mean, there was almost all the senior managers said safeguarding is everyone's business, but then they'd have to.
Yeah, sure. But did you think within your specialists, you have 3 specialist models?
Yeah.
Were any one of those any better at increasing people's confidence?
No, they weren't. I mean, that was one of the issues. There didn't seem to be a relationship between confidence in safeguarding and model of safeguarding. It didn't have that. There wasn't that strong effect, which is why, you know, we thought actually, well, model maybe not as important a variable as we thought it was. But a negative finding is still a finding, by the way.
Now, my question kind of follows up on that, actually, which is that I think my feeling from practice is that a lot of the time you want all the social workers to be very confident about safeguarding because once you push it into a very, only these specialist people over here can do it, the others sort of think, oh, well, I don't need to worry. Whereas actually it might be coming up all the time in work that they do, which isn't called safeguarding.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? So I was intrigued as well that you weren't able to say, well, this model's much better because generally speaking, it means more people are.
Well, I think we had advantages and disadvantages from the different models, and I guess there's an element of there being a basic sort of awareness and understanding of, because you know, of what it could well be safeguarding and needs addressing that everyone just needs all the time. But if you've got them, yes, I mean it's the distinction is with the processes of investigation and you know how decisions are made around developing a safeguarding plan. That's a different kind of, there's a sort of different kind of knowledge that's needed if you're engaging in that.
Yeah, I think the other interesting thing is the 2 contexts, isn't it? The whole care home, care provided services and whether they're up to the standard they should be, and the kind of everybody runs around and panicky about this care home. And actually the focus on people in their communities and their families. And I do think we need to kind of try and do something like that because there's a whole CQC arrangement in place that regulates and inspects these services. And then we're sucking all the kind of resource from social workers into that as well. So it doesn't seem quite right.
Yes. There wasn't a question, was it?
No, it's just a comment.
It's just a comment. Sorry.
I'm Jo Moriarty from the Social Care Workforce Research Unit. Martin, this is just a comment as well. I think sometimes there's a real pressure upon researchers to come up with an easy answer. Everybody wants to believe that you can improve safeguarding practice by having this magic model out there. And actually, because for all the complexities of the things that Lynn has said, you know, about issues about different criteria for safeguarding within the home and within care homes, because of things like different access to training, different experiences, there isn't an easy answer, and sometimes it's like what you say about a negative finding still being a finding in itself. That there's an awful lot of pressure on people to want to say, oh, well, probably you didn't do this. That's all you would have discovered that X model was better than another, but actually it's because the reality is, as you said, each model brings different advantages and disadvantages.
For different kinds of authority, in different kind of context. The other thing around, I mean, one of the factors, that was mentioned as, a sort of important background factor was poverty. How that was driving, some of the issues around poverty and the austerity policies were driving the complexities and driving some of that, underpinning some of just some of the safeguarding issues, which was that came out quite strongly in a way. It's not quite relevant to the main topic, but it was quite an aside.
When Martin mentioned that the clock was wrong in the other room, I changed my watch, and I hope I did it accurately and I'm not giving an early bath, but I think it's nearly time to finish, according to my watch. So can I thank all the speakers and all of you for your attention and contribution, and I hope you enjoyed the session.